Hello everyone, welcome to Field Notes, an exploration of functional medicine. I'm Rob Downey, a family practice MD and Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioner. I'm coming to you from Seaworthy Functional Medicine in Homer, Alaska. Seaworthy exists to help people overcome their health challenges and be fully vital. Today we are fortunate enough to be joined by Hannah Crum, who is a mind-blowing expert in all things kombucha and living liquids, including this huge and diverse cookbook, a website, resources, support for this. I liked it that as I was getting ready for this, you're healing the world one gut at a time. Is that right, Hannah?
Yes. In symbiosis.
Welcome. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, David. I'm excited to be here.
Right on. Well, I get to meet my tribe every week, and this week is no different. It just totally lights me up getting to talk to thought leaders like you. And your area is particularly salient because I'm always encouraging so many of my patients to use living foods, but also because not only do I want our audience and our listeners to learn, but I have a number of questions myself that I've always wanted to bring to an expert like you. So I think it's going to be great.
Thank you.
Let's just start with, part of it, I just appreciate you indulging us because some of the questions you get asked over and over again, it might be like a rock band, playing a song they've already done 500 or 1,000 times, but I'll try to make sure and ask you some things that you haven't been asked as well. But why should we drink kombucha and benefit from living food? Let's start there.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, have you tried kombucha yourself, David? Have you had the
I have.
Yes.
I love it. But one of my later questions is going to be, it's pretty tart and snappy, but yes, I do like it. I wonder though if I like the sweeter stuff that maybe I should be getting it brewed a little longer and stronger so it's got more living things and less carbs, but I don't want to put the cart before the horse.
Yeah, totally. But I think, a lot of folks maybe still might not even be familiar with kombucha. So kombucha, as you're hearkening to, is a fermented beverage. It is fermented tea. So other fermented beverages we're more familiar with would be things like beer, which is fermented malt and hops, wine, which is fermented grape juice, cider, hard cider, which is fermented apple juice. And so this is our fermentation process is tea and sugar. And we use what we call a SCOBY, which is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, a very literal acronym that converts the sugars in the sugar, in the sweet tea, and enhances the nutritional value of the tea itself. So the polyphenols, the antioxidants, all of that gets enhanced. Now, the other great thing about fermentation, the root word is fervere, which means to boil. And that's because when ancient man would open up their little crock pot of sauerkraut or kefir or kombucha, whatever they were making, and they saw all these bubbles on top, and they looked the same as the bubbles you see in boiling water. Now, those bubbles are created by yeast. And yeast are so clever and smart. They do a lot of really smart things. First of all, they're constantly enticing human beings to cultivate them through a couple of different mechanisms. One are these bubbles, which indicate that nutrients are here. So yeast contain all the B vitamins in living form. Now, they aren't necessarily making them in massive doses or massive quantities, but because they're present in living form, your body can instantly uptake those nutrients and get the benefit of them plugging right in, including that ever-elusive B12. Again, not in massive doses, but in living amount, in living form. The other thing that yeast creates is alcohol. So we're all very familiar with, even wildlife enjoying overripe bananas and things like that. So humans very much enjoy alcohol. Now, alcohol in kombucha is different from in your beer and wine in that it does not create a euphoric state. It is there as a preservative. So think of it more like you use rubbing alcohol to clean a wound. It's antimicrobial. And so it's a really smart defense mechanism that the yeast have because it prevents other organisms from being able to proliferate in that sweet tea. And that makes kombucha one of these really safe things that we can make at home, like all fermented foods and drinks.
Oh, that's so cool. So I was looking at your resources and I see that things can be made with either cane sugar or honey. And one question I had is there any reason that the tea has to be caffeinated? I've often thought a really nice time for me to have kombucha would be later in the day. I should mention to our audience and listeners, who I thank for joining us, that this particular interview is exciting for me in that I'll be acting on what you share. And so I'm going to be making my kombucha from your recipes and products. So, that's just going to be a blast. That's part of the fun of my job. So is there like a herbal version I could do later in the day to not have the caffeine hit?
Great question. The caffeine stimulates the yeast just like it stimulates us. And what that means, though, is that the caffeine present in tea, so first of all, while it is similar to what's in coffee, it has the unique presence of L-theanine. L-theanine helps to calm the body down and relax you. And this is why when we're drinking cups of tea, yes, we're going to get a little energy boost, but we're not going to have that same spike and crash that we experience with coffee. And that's because L-theanine's there just making sure the body's a little more balanced as that process is happening. And so, yes, we're using caffeinated tea as our primary substrate in our fermentation process. So let's just talk about tea. Tea is Camellia sinensis. We call a lot of things tea that aren't tea at all, but Camellia sinensis, all tea comes from the same tea plant. So black tea, white tea, green tea, oolong, pu'er, etc. They're all coming from the same plant. When it's processed, how it's picked, that is what's giving us these differences in flavor profiles. The white tea is the very young leaves, and so it's higher in antioxidants, whereas the green leaves have been exposed to oxygen, so they have a little more green to them. And then the more oxidized you go, the darker the tea leaf. And that's where our black teas are most oxidized or exposed to oxygen. They call it fermentation, but it's a different process. It's actually oxidation. All that is to say is that the amount of tea you use for kombucha is a lot less than if you were to say use 1 tea bag per 8 ounces of liquid. So it's a lot less to begin with. Secondarily, as I mentioned, the yeast also are stimulated by the caffeine, which means some of the caffeine is utilized in the fermentation process. So the vast majority of folks, unless they are extremely caffeine sensitive, can enjoy kombucha even in the evening. Got to go back to your question. Can you make an herbal kombucha? The short answer is yes. Kombucha, just like all fermentation, is flexible technology. So while when we get our first culture and starter liquid, we're always going to want to do that in tea, sugar, etc. Once you have extra cultures, because it's highly reproductive, it's literally abundance in action. Once you have an extra culture, go ahead. Do a chamomile kombucha, do a hibiscus kombucha, do a ginger kombucha, where you're just using those elements in primary. You'll still need the sugar, but you can mix and match. And the book, of course, has loads of recipes and loads of ideas for how you can change those things up.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So I know we're going to want to encourage people to make their own. I saw in the preparatory materials, though, you have advice for people about how to know if they're buying at the store, whether it's because they're busy or they're going to experiment with kombucha. There are ways for them to know if they're getting the real deal, the good stuff, versus the not so good stuff. So let's go there next.
Yeah, sure. So let me just offer some context so folks know I know what I'm talking about here. My husband and I, Alex, also co-founded Kombucha Brewers International, where I serve as president. And so I work with kombucha brands around the globe. Through the trade association, we're here to promote, protect, and really we do a ton of education. And that education is to regulators, it's to government agencies. We even have a Kombucha Act, which we're trying to get through Congress to help protect our industry. And so, we're very up on all of the different types of kombucha. And in fact, in July last year, we released our first kombucha code of practice. And so the code of practice outlines that there are different types of kombucha you can purchase at the store. So the vast majority of kombucha you're going to try and see is what we call traditional kombucha. So this is kombucha that, again, counterculture, started at home on your countertop. Then you had a love of it, or they had a love of it. They saw how it helped themselves or their family member with a health challenge, and they were inspired to share it with their community. So the vast majority of kombucha out there is going to be traditional kombucha. And the way you can test it to make sure that it is by pouring a little in a glass, setting it aside for about a week or so, and see if a SCOBY forms. So that's a really fun way to experiment. if you want to, if you're willing to sacrifice some kombucha and see if yours is vibrant. Of course, if you're seeing culture strands or weird stuff floating in there or little glob tries to get in your mouth, it's definitely a traditional kombucha. Mm-hmm. From there, we have pasteurized kombucha. So that's pretty straightforward to understand, just like you have raw juice, right? Fresh pressed juice, and then you have pasteurized juice. So this is where heat or other processes are exerted to the kombucha in order to render it shelf stable. So it essentially kills the living organism component. Now the acids and whatnot of kombucha are still present, but it may not have that same effect that you're getting from, just like if you eat a piece of raw fruit versus you're having some sort of pasteurized fruit, you're going to have a difference in how it's impacting your body. And then finally, again, just like juice, there's a from concentrate. So this is where they are speeding up the fermentation process. They're usually fermenting it to the point where there's no sugars present. So basically at the edge of sort of a vinegar type state. Those are then diluted with water. Probiotics and flavors are often added back in. And usually those are also pasteurized or shelf stable as well. So those are kind of the three different buckets of kombucha. They all are going to have their specific use occasion when they're more appropriate. They're going to have different flavor profiles. And so really it's about finding what tastes good and then what makes you feel good. Mm. And, the top three benefits that most people mention when they drink kombucha is improved digestion, increased energy, and it just makes me feel good. So as long as you're hitting those three things, you probably have a good kombucha for you.
Right on. Well, that distinction is so helpful, and it makes me realize my question was mischaracterized in terms of good versus not so good. What I should have said is different. There are varieties of processing, and so as long as people are clear-eyed then about what they're getting.
That's exactly right. And that's the whole point of what we're trying to do. We're just trying to create transparency. We want the consumer to make that informed decision. Look, we could have all the crunchy hippie people drinking the traditional kombucha, but we want our industry, like soda, we want to be everywhere. And so how do we get into every home? How do we do that? Well, we have to have products that fit everybody's different needs. As I mentioned before, there's trace amounts of alcohol created in the fermentation process. And part of what the Kombucha Act allows us to let that number go up slightly to 1.25% before taxation occurs. And the reason that exists is because, again, as a living food, it can continue to change in the bottle, even if we keep it in that cold storage. Now, the current law stipulates it has to be at 0.5% lower. And again, remember, these numbers come from Prohibition, from when they said absolutely no alcohol can be consumed 100 years ago when we all went a little crazy. Clearly, that experiment didn't work, and we had to, a few years later, undo that mess. But that's where these numbers come from. And so, of course, 100 years ago, nobody was making kombucha commercially and selling it in a bottle. So there was no reason to understand that these products, because of Mother Nature, have this slightly elevated amount. Again, I'll just reiterate, these don't create any sort of euphoria. They don't create an altered state of consciousness. They are a health beverage. And so anyone who's been making and drinking kombucha at home, yes, there's trace amounts of alcohol in there, but you probably don't even notice it. And here's the other side benefit I noticed from drinking kombucha, and I've heard a lot of folks say it, is that your cravings for alcohol decrease. Your cravings for sugar decrease. There's something about including the organic acids present from kombucha and other fermented foods that creates a rebalancing of the body. It also allows you to taste your food more clearly. Like when we eat a bunch of sugar-fried products or processed foods, there's almost like a coating that sort of ends up on your tongue, and you can't really perceive more subtle flavors. And so when you start to strip that away, again, think of acid, think of vinegar, think of drain cleaner. I don't mean drinking drain cleaner, but like think of your pipes. You want to clear out the pipes. This is what kombucha does. And so it strips away that that sort of coating of sugar so you can start to taste your food again. And, you probably have experienced this yourself in your health journey. Like vegetables actually taste really delicious, and in fact can even be slightly sweet, even though they have an alkaline effect. And that's when your tongue is dialed in. You can taste those flavors better, and they aren't just a pile of mush.
This is all so cool. So the things that I wanted to kind of add and underscore to what you're saying, I found it sort of when we have to pick the top three things that some superfood does, it's always got a little ironic twist, because there's probably an unlimited list of things that we could relate to ingesting living food with this sort of mind-blowing nutritional content. And I think some of the most exciting clinical science that's coming out now and in the last 10 years is how our gut microbiome, aided by these friendly assistants that we're putting in with the kombucha to grow more colonies, grow diversity, et cetera, has unlimited impacts on our health, whether it's 75% plus of the serotonin neurotransmitters in the brain being made by the gut, or the immune system calming down and doing its job in the midst of a worldwide pandemic. It just goes on and on. So it's so nice getting people turned on to kombucha and other living foods, because the investment to yield ratio is so high.
Agreed. And kombucha is not for everybody, right? Like, I love kombucha. I'm a sour head. I'm a pickle juice drinker, lover, so when I took that very first sip of kombucha, for me, it was like, oh, the heavens opened up and the angels were singing. Because at the time I was sad. I was standard American diet. I was, still basically eating college food, ramen and, stuff I stuck in the microwave. And, this was before I had any consciousness about, the nutritional value of different foods. And so to have that immediate reaction of those enzymes and nutrients in my body, I just fell in love with it. And it turned from, passion into hobby. I wanted to teach people about it because there was so much misinformation, and that just evolved into a whole career. So I had no idea this is what I was going to be when I grew up. I had no inkling, but I'm absolutely glad to be here. And so when I say kombucha is not for everybody, not everybody loves those sour flavors like I do. Although sour and bitter are the flavors of health and digestion, as I'm sure you know. That said, the honey kombucha, or Jun, when we're using the raw honey, that has a lighter flavor profile. Another fermented beverage that might be good for folks to try, especially if they're averse to the sour flavors, is water kefir. Water kefir is made from tibikos, which look like little crystals. They literally ferment sugar water, and they just have a lighter flavor profile. So for some folks, it can be more approachable. For other folks, it could be milk kefir, which is one of my other favorite fermented beverages. Here we're inoculating milk, usually pasteurized milk, because raw milk, while it's legal here in California, it's still, $20 a gallon. That's not really cost effective in terms of what we're doing here. But when we take milk kefir grains and inoculate them into pasteurized milk, here we are reintroducing the bacteria that consume the lactose. So we're taking a potentially allergenic food, re-inoculating it with healthy bacteria, and turning it into a food that then has a benefit for your body. So what I love about fermentation is it's taking these substances that sometimes we might think, oh, well, if I overconsume these, they might not be good for me, like, too much sugar or pasteurized dairy, and converts them back into healthy living foods. So the ingredients are simple. They're easy to make at home. They're incredibly safe. It's the only reason they've been around for thousands of years, is because if they were so easily infected, our ancestors would have tossed it on the compost heap ages ago. So the fact that they're still around is just a testament to how hardy and easy they are to work with.
Nice. Yeah, let me add one thing on that note for our listeners, which is that if you look at the safety of living foods like kombucha, the worldwide literature on people that have ever, quote, developed an infection, unquote, from the ingestion of living food, it's on the order of like 1 in a billion. And those rare cases are all people who are immunosuppressed. So they've had like their bone marrow wiped out to prepare for a bone marrow transplant, or they've got a transplanted organ, so their immune systems are 100% suppressed via medication. And typically they've consumed doses of living food that most of us, even those of us that love living food, would consider not heroic, but foolhardy. And so that's my perspective on the safety. I don't know if you want to qualify that or change that at all.
Well, it's just like, how many blueberries should you eat? How much asparagus should you have? I mean, I think like it's a weird thing that we are at in this world where, we have to go look at the numbers. What do the numbers say? Like as if the numbers actually mean anything, which they don't a lot of times because, you know, how one is, the nutritional content of this exact piece of asparagus versus, this grape over, right? It's not ever going to be consistent or the same. So I just like to remind people these aren't drugs. These are foods. And so, fermentation is something that evolved with human beings because we are bacteria based, which is what I love about the human microbiome research is that we recognize that we could not exist on this planet if it weren't for bacteria. And bacteria are really awesome open source creatures, right? Like their cell walls will rupture, their DNA gets set free. That then gets picked up. In bad cases, those turn into superbugs, right? In good cases, they evolve into things that continue to grow. And so, when we're consuming fermented foods, they've always been used as condiments, right? So that sauerkraut on your Reuben is there to help you digest all that meat and bread. Mustard and ketchup, which was originally a fermented fish sauce. These were all just like pops of flavor, little zingy things with digestive enzymes that were intended to help you process and digest the foods you were consuming. And so whenever we're consuming foods in a living form, they're absolutely good for us. To the safety point, you are absolutely correct. Look, some people are even allergic to strawberries. Are we out there saying, beware of strawberries, the danger of strawberries, or shrimp, or right? Like there's so many, but like anybody can have a negative reaction to any food these days because our immune systems are so out of whack. And so again, trust your gut isn't about just what tastes good to me on my tongue. It's about how does this make me feel at the end of the day. So we love to use kombucha as a way to close biofeedback loops to really start to listen what actually is supporting my organism versus what does my brain think is good for me, but my body is telling me it's not, right? And so we're so disconnected because there's so much confusing information, even about what we should be eating or not eating. And so much of it comes out of the processed foods industry, right? They have to give us these tricky numbers because they need cheap ingredients, which are subsidized in order to create an endless permutation of the same foodstuffs. The omnivore's dilemma really clearly laid that out by Michael Pollan about how essentially we're monocropped. We're eating monocrops because that's what we're given access to. And we have to make that extra effort to connect with the farmers, to find the food that's grown in alignment with, sort of how we always ate. And yet we have to make a special effort to get back to that these days. And it's just unfortunate because I think subsidies can work. We just need to be subsidizing the right things and the right ways of farming as opposed to this really sort of bottom line thought process that doesn't take planet or human bodies into account.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad you invoked Michael Pollan. I didn't get to be there, but my mentor, who's a naturopathic doctor, she got to hear Michael Pollan speak at the Institute for Functional Medicine Annual International Conference 5-6 years ago-ish down in San Francisco, and that year's topic was food. And she said that when he introduced himself to the audience, he said, "I am not here as a food scientist, despite the fact that I'm standing in a room of food scientists. I am here as an eater."
Yeah. I mean, but it's been tremendous. The level of insight, the sort of human anthropology aspect he's brought to a sort of better understanding. Another person whose work I really love is Sandor Katz. And of course, his fermentation books, but really I'm speaking of The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved. I can't remember if it's out of print or not, but that book was so seminal in recognizing that, look, what happened. Processed foods ended up becoming a status symbol. Tired moms didn't want to have to cook everything all the time. And it really shifted how we perceive food. And unfortunately, we're stuck now with this, with all these foodstuffs that aren't good for us. And we're constantly having to advocate that pesticides be removed. In my opinion, again, it's reversed. We should be charging more for the foods that are toxic and poisonous than we should for the ones that are grown organically or that keep the planet and people in mind as well. But how we get there, I don't know. So that's why we have to start one gut at a time, eating our fermented foods and drinks. And because then when we get healthier, we have the energy, like we're not just sick at home, tired, unable to even care for our families or even ourselves sometimes. We then have energy to reconnect with community and try to take our passion to the next level and ensure that everybody has access to great foods. I mean, I'm sure that's what inspired your journey, David, to do what you do. But gosh, that's why we're all in this together, trying to make this change happen.
Right, right. I think that the odd sort of situation that's happening where I was fortunate enough to talk to Ocean Robbins recently, and it's uncanny how similar your message is to his. So no surprise, another preeminent thought leader flagging these sort of larger dimensions of how whole food that sustains us, which is affordable, everybody wins, it's right there within reach. It's good news at a time that some folks are really intimidated by this feeling that there isn't good news or there isn't enough good news. One way I've started to conceptualize functional medicine and the benefits is that there's this essentially sort of island of benefit in the midst of these toxic cultural trends. And as we can expand that island and grow it more quickly, then the blessings that you and I experience, we're expanding that footprint, which is good for everyone. And probably the funnest part, though, I think is what you're invoking, is just the kind of shock when somebody gets rolling on kombucha or other living foods, where they're lit up immediately and consistently over time, and they come back and say, "Are you kidding me? This was right there the whole time. Like, how did I miss out on this?"
Well, and it's interesting because some of the research shows that even with kombucha, our household penetration in the United States is under 10%. So, I mean, we have a lot more education to do. But what's exciting is by connecting with folks like yourself and, with the type of work that you do, people are waking up. And it's unfortunate they're waking up because they're sick. But if that's what it takes, if we need, we've got enough canaries that have already died in the coal mine. But if that's what it takes is that kind of situation, then it is a blessing, because what it does is it sets you on the path to learning more about your health and to take ownership of your health in different ways than maybe you ever would have considered without that type of health crisis happening. And so as frustrating as, as like, it's not fun to be sick, right? Like, no one is saying, hey, go out and get sick, because then your life will change for the better. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be hard. But when you can find those foods that fit in, that's really huge. So one other person kombucha is not right for is anyone with a histamine allergy, right? So all fermented foods are going to be challenging for folks who have histamine allergies. Unfortunately, a lot of times, the symptoms that kombucha can help alleviate are similar to those who have a histamine allergy. So you might be taking fermented foods thinking, hey, this is supposed to help me. But this is, again, that trust your gut. If what's happening is you're continuing to feel bloated after consuming them, or you're continuing to just not feel good, then that might be a sign you need to dig a little deeper, find out, are fermented foods right for me right now? Any person with a reasonable immune system, they're great. They're going to have that positive effect. But if you're in a situation where you are more immunocompromised, then you want to just work with a practitioner like yourself to try to figure that out. What's going on, so that you aren't unintentionally exposing yourself to something that's actually causing a problem.
I've noticed also that people with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, often I'll find it because these good organisms are coming in. The SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, I think of it as good organisms living in the wrong neighborhood, small intestine. And then as these additional good guys come in through the lacto-fermented foods, living foods, they'll add to those colonies where they don't belong. And so probiotic supplements or probiotic-rich foods will backfire. And that's often how I know to offer that person a SIBO breath test. It's not that I don't think of it as any harm. I just think of it as kind of diagnostic, like we better explore this avenue, because normally people feel great bringing in living organisms. So if you don't, we need to figure out why.
And that's really the whole thing. Every body is different. every body is going to have a different response. And that's why I'm not telling anybody to do what I do, because what I do is what works for me. And I've got my own problems too, right? Like we're all on this health journey together, each figuring out what's right for us and recombining things and trying different things. And, so this is what listening to your body is about, cultivating your own ability to really hear the way your body communicates with you, if that's with pain, if that's with dreams, if that's with, stomach upset. So whatever it is, it's really about coming back into your body, because you can describe your symptoms all day long to somebody else, but they never can truly understand or experience what you're talking about. And, as we've seen, unfortunately, right, like people who aren't listened to by the medical institutions that be, or who are told it's all in your head, right? Like how challenging has that been for so many people just to even be heard? And that's why I'm really grateful that we have this huge rise in functional doctors, because I think allopathy is just one thought process, and yet it's become the dominant paradigm here, and it doesn't actually fit with our historic background, which was really rooted in herbalism and homeopathy and looking to Mother Nature, who has so many more solutions available to us with far fewer side effects than what's being presented by allopathy. Now, it doesn't mean there isn't a place for allopathy, certainly, but being the default isn't really the best fit for it. I think the default needs to be the herbs, the natural remedies, the things that are more subtle, that work with the body in a gentler way. And then if you have something that's more difficult to manage, yes, go to the allopathy at that point. But we're kind of doing it backwards right now. And unfortunately, just even our insurance system is so messed up. It really is the biggest, it's one of the biggest frustrations of being in supposedly the best country in the world. At least that's how we think of ourselves, or have been taught to think of ourselves. And then to see the disparity we have in terms of how we care for folks, it's just, this is what we're trying to turn around, right, with our different modalities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with all your observations. All I would add is, I think Dr. Jeffrey Bland, the father of functional medicine, made a really intriguing observation when he thinks that this place we're in now, maybe the genesis of it, was the advent of penicillin and this one bug, one drug kind of miracle cure feeling that came from being able to treat these bacterial infections, then led the conventional allopathic medical community to become very enamored of this one-to-one relationship in terms of conceptualizing one diagnosis, one treatment. Then you superimpose technology and the sort of medical industrial business alliance all arising together. And now I would very much tend to concur, like many Institute for Functional Medicine trained providers, that will use these one-to-one therapies that are best reserved for severe or life-threatening situations, straightening broken bones, killing bacteria, resecting brain tumors. We'll use those things first for complex chronic issues that have a complex chronic backstory. And so I love having conventional medicine for what it's good for. I just think it's ironic that 80% plus of what we treat, it doesn't have a one-to-one issue. It requires just a nuanced understanding of the person's story.
Exactly. And I mean, so much of health is also connected to our mental health. And I loved earlier when you were talking about how much of that is created in your gut. That was such a revelation for me. I just assumed there's like a little pharmacy in my brain dispensing happy chemicals. And then to realize it's actually coming from deep within me. Like I think of the gut as the first brain, right? Because it really isn't a this way relationship. It's a this way relationship, right? Like your gut has to be what's healthy in order to create sanity. Sane is the same root as like health, right? Like that's how we get mental health, is through gut health. And when we try to take those things apart, I think we do a disservice, because it's really hard to treat something without going to that root cause, going to that gut level and figuring it out. So, and this is what's great about fermented foods and different modalities, is bringing everything together, because part of what fermented foods do, yes, we can go to the store and be a consumer and just grab it off the shelf. But when you start making it at home, right, there's something about when you make your own food, when you make your own medicine, when you grow your own herbs. There's an energy, there's a relationship, there's another type of symbiosis that occurs. There's a communication. I often call kombucha a cross between a pet and a plant. Now, it's not going to crawl up on your lap, thankfully, but you do end up with this real like relationship with it. But like a plant or a pet, one of the other things I think kombucha teaches us is when you give a living organism what it needs to thrive, it will.
Yeah.
And that's true for us as well, right? We're living organisms. If we give us what we need in order to thrive, we will.
Right on. It reminds me of the song I haven't thought about in the longest time, but my wife and I used to listen to an artist named Michelle Shocked, and she had this album called Short, Sharp, and Shocked. And one of the songs was about Anchorage in reference to where I live in Alaska. But same album, she had this double entendre in her music because the refrain was, if you want the best jam, you've got to make your own. And she was referring to both preserves and making music. And I always thought that song was really clever.
Well, think about love. Like when something's made with love, you really, right? Like even if it is a processed food, but it's made with love, there's something else about it than just the ingredients, right? I think so often we want to ignore the sort of energetic, spiritual, however you want to sort of frame that. I think what's great is we have all these different contexts that we can talk about this, but there really is an indwelling of life in everything, and especially on our planet, and these herbs and these whole foods and these things we're talking about. And even if you choose to eat meat, I really feel that when we consider how Native American traditions would honor it, they would thank the spirits for giving them this gift of nutrition. They would use every part of the animal. And I think when we approach our food with that level of reverence, we're still going to maybe sometimes grab that fast food every once in a while, but you're going to have just a different energy, a different thought process around it. And that I think is a healthier relationship to food than just, what's coming in the styrofoam package and now I throw it in a pan or whatever.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then we form food friendships, and then all of those kind of what I think of as icky or sad, sort of like body perception issues, shoulds or shouldn'ts, motivation out of should. I see those as going away as people form these food friendships with this thing that have smell and taste, and they bubble and they motivate us and they pique our curiosity. And as we hang out more with our new friends are so vivacious and interesting, we just kind of auto-regulate those old relationships rather than driving them away. And there's also this tendency when we try to push away our old friends, they kind of spring back, but if we just let them drift off and diminish, I think that often works a lot better. And I think it's a more what you're describing is a more harmonious path forward that I see in my practice, just as much more sustainable and joyful, which is also part of getting the benefits of the food, because then we turn on our rest and digest nervous system and actually bring in those nutrients by running the software to our gut. So it just kind of goes on and on.
I love it. I love this modality, and I just love the different ways we can enter into this conversation. And all I was going to say here is just that try it. Just try it. Just give it a try and see if it's for you. Like I said before, kombucha curbs sugar cravings. And I think sometimes that feels confrontational for people because, the things we're addicted to, oftentimes it's because we have certain microbes in our body that have grown used to eating that food source. And they are advocating for their life, right? Candida, which is, present in the gut naturally, right? It's what they call an opportunistic pathogen, meaning only when it has the opportunity to shift into a pathogenic relationship does that happen. So it isn't necessarily inherently bad on its own. It is something we need in our system. I think they figured that out about H. pylori, that certainly it has a role in creating ulcers, but without it, you might end up with esophageal cancer. So, that back to that sort of thing you were saying about the one-to-one, it doesn't work because you're not thinking of the entire system as a whole. And when we start to recognize that it's because it's out of balance and those organisms are driving your cravings, not your actual, what your body actually needs. And that's, again, trust your gut isn't just oh, I feel hungry for this, I'm going to eat it. It's paying attention. How do you then feel when you put those things in your body so that you're making that better choice? And sometimes when you go through that die-off period, it doesn't feel good, but it didn't take one day to get to a state of dysbiosis. It's going to take more than a week to get out of it. And it's just about continuing to track your progress and see those benefits slowly over time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. As people shift the good things coming in, then their internal microbiome, I see it shift all the time, and there can be a roily kind of turbulent, kind of low-grade healing storm, as it were. And I encourage people, as long as it's not severe and overwhelming, just to ride it out. I wanted to make sure, you've been so generous with your time today, and just ask you two brief things that, again, I'm sure you're asked, but super helpful for the people that check out this podcast to know. So if people are worried that they have yeast overgrowth, do they need to think about yeast being involved in how kombucha is made? And same thread, do people who are really paying close attention to carbohydrate consumption need to attend to how many carbohydrates are coming in from kombucha, with the caveat that the more potently it's brewed, presumably the more of it's been chewed up by the living organisms by the time we ingest it?
Great questions. Yeah. So kombucha also creates candida inhibitors, so caprylic acid and things like this. Now I'll say this, right? Again, you got to pay attention to what you're consuming. If you're fermenting your kombucha to that more sour flavor profile, then likely it's not going to have a negative impact, even if you have candida overgrowth. The problem is if you're not getting it to that more tangy profile, you're letting it stay on the sweet side, those residual sugars could potentially be feeding that candida. And that's where, again, you got to listen to your body, and you got to figure out, am I feeding the candida or am I starving it out? Because many people who've had candida overgrowth have found drinking kombucha for a period of, several weeks can actually help eliminate or minimize those symptoms and help bring it back into balance. So it's not a one size fits all answer in that regard. You got to try it out, see how you're reacting to it, and then make that informed decision based on your experience. To the other point about the sugars, here's the interesting thing, right? Like, you say the word sugar, and what do people think of?
Candy bars, cookies,
all kinds of stuff. But I always say, consider the source. Are we talking about a grass that's been grown for 5,000 years that humans have been consuming through all of time, that creates a feedback loop in the brain so that when you consume it, there's actual energy received and satiety is created, and then you no longer crave it, right? Like, sugar is what every living organism on this planet consumes. It's everywhere. Or are we talking about something that's been processed with petrochemicals in a lab to create an addictive substance that doesn't close the feedback loop, that creates even more harmful impacts? Then yeah, absolutely. That stuff needs to be taxed and get it out of your food supply, right? But I think we end up with these unnatural fears of natural foods because they share a similar name on purpose in order to confuse you. So first, consider the source. Second, the fermentation process. This is what I mentioned before. The beauty of fermentation is it's basically digestion that's happening outside of the body. And so what's going on is the organisms are breaking. So the yeast secretes invertase, which then cuts the disaccharide of sugar of sucrose into fructose and glucose. So these have a lower glycemic impact on the body. Plus, then those sugars feed the bacteria feed on, leads them to create things like gluconic and glucuronic acid. Those acids specifically really help support a healthy liver. And so folks who have diabetes, people who suffer from cancer, people who have metabolic disease, a lot of them have actually been helped by drinking kombucha because it supports a healthy liver. It's also why kombucha is a great hangover cure and my favorite cocktail mixer because it ensures that I can have more than one, but I won't go too far overboard and I won't feel terrible the next day. But all of that silliness aside, really it is those acids that makes kombucha so special and different from the milk kefir, the water kefir, and other types of fermented beverages, because those acids are just what make that process happen. So basically, as you probably already know, the liver is what filters out all of our xenobiotics, right? So anything that comes into the body that maybe shouldn't be there, the liver is going to halt it and stop it from going through. Now, our bodies naturally make glucuronic acid. We just don't make enough of it because of how toxic our environment is. And so what happens is those toxins get sequestered into your fat cells, right? And so over time, your body gradually becomes more saturated with toxins. So what kombucha does is that glucuronic acid creates an unbreakable bond within any toxin. So then through hydrolysis, which is drinking water and going pee, you flush those out of your body. So drinking water with kombucha is awesome. So like if you find kombucha that's been fermented for a while, a little too intense, water it down. Just like a little ice cube in your scotch is going to open up that flavor and make it taste real delicious. A little water in your booch is going to do the same thing. It's going to shift that pH, make it more palatable. You're still getting all the benefit of the acids and you're flushing your body at the same time. And so that glucuronic acid is really sort of that superpower of kombucha in terms of helping to support your metabolic system. And so folks who are carb conscious, again, look for the kombuchas that have that, more tangy flavor, that have been fermented a little longer, or when you're making it at home, you can reduce the sugar somewhat, but if you reduce it too much, you end up removing too many of the nutrients. And so you end up with a flavor profile that isn't as good. So we're always balancing flavor with benefit there. But a lot of folks on Whole30 or other types of keto, paleo, that kind of thing. We even have a blog post on the Kombucha Camp website. We have a ton of resources and no ads. So it's a really fun site to visit because you're not constantly getting popped up at, yes, the answer is yes, anyone can enjoy it. It's just a matter of figuring out where your profile is.
What a blast talking to you. So people can drill down on the notes from this podcast, the blog transcripts. Also, we'll have places they can click and get straight to you. And as I was reviewing it, like a lot of thought leaders, there's a bunch of ways in. People can go to your book. They can go to the other resources. They can go to the website. So it's very easy to get to you and get started, it looks like.
That is true. And so we do, I think you're going to share a link to our recipe page. Anyone can sign up there. You're going to get a download with the DIY guide. It's going to walk you through how to make your own kombucha at home step by step. You'll have brewing logs, super easy to work on. Then we send an email a day for 5 days that just sort of walks you through, helps you understand what kombucha is. After that, we try to leave you alone for the most part. But coming and getting that knowledge, I think, has been really helpful for a lot of folks because, what I've learned is we're very niche and this isn't for everybody. And so we're not here to say, hey, this is one size fits all, you've got to try it. It's more what resonates with you. Come, try it on, see how it feels. Does this seem interesting to you? Because most people aren't just picking up pets and plants at random unless they know they're going to be committed to taking care of them.
Well, kombucha is a game changer. And so it's just been such a blast talking to you. Thank you so much for your time and for what you do.
Thanks, David. Thank you for having me on and thanks for what you do. This has been such a fun conversation. Really grateful to get a chance to connect with your audience. And don't forget to trust your gut.
Nice. Seaworthy exists for people to overcome their health challenges and be fully vital. Please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review if we've earned it, and going to our website podcast tab for any questions or comments you'd like to share with us. Thanks.